When the millionaire heard his son's screams, his heart sank. He was used to power and wealth, but what he saw when he entered the room made him question everything he thought was real. Would his father be able to handle a secret that could destroy his family? Outside the window, dusk was slowly thickening over the upscale neighborhood of Westchester, New York. The huge estate with its long driveway looked immaculate. Neatly trimmed bushes, marble steps leading up to the front door, and gorgeous panoramic windows. But behind the exterior splendor was a tension that could be felt everywhere. Inside the mansion, James Lexington, a tall man with sharp features and a shirt that was always impeccably ironed, paced the living room. His hair had grayed noticeably in recent months, and his eyes had faded. A pile of papers lay on the table in front of him, but he couldn't concentrate on any of them. "Minus Mr. Lexington, are you sure you want to continue this conversation today?" Ashley Spencer, his assistant, asked timidly, standing nearby. "I'm sure," he replied firmly, trying to keep his voice calm. "My son's home from school and he's in trouble again. I don't want to postpone the decision any longer." His son, 12-year-old Nathan Lexington, had just returned from another summons to the principal's office. For James, this was not the first time he had been asked to come to school immediately. This time, the principal notified him that Nathan was being suspended for inappropriate behavior and a conflict with a teacher. For a boy who had already changed schools twice in the last 6 months, this could have been the final verdict. "Where is he now?" James asked Ashley. "In his room. He seems to have slammed the door shut and doesn't want to talk to anyone." James sighed heavily and headed upstairs. Meanwhile, the figure of a lean man in an old-fashioned suit appeared in the downstairs hallway. It was Ethan Miller, the man James had been corresponding with for the past week through a third party, trying to keep everything private. For a long time, James had been told that troubled teens should be simply grounded. But life had shown that such methods didn't work. Now someone advised him to turn to a little-known teacher who was rumored to have a special gift for understanding troubled children. "Come in, Mr. Miller," Ashley called out. "Minus Mr. Lexington will be ready for you shortly." Ethan nodded and placed a simple leather bag by the entrance. His suit looked old but neat. His shirt was heavily laundered, and his shoes were stubby. From the outside, he looked like a humble postal clerk, not a personal tutor for a spoiled child from a wealthy family, but there was confidence and kindness in his eyes. A few minutes later, James came downstairs. When he saw Ethan in person for the first time, he frowned. The man looked so unattractive, so poor, that it was hard to believe he had exceptional skills. But there was no choice. "Minus Mr. Miller, thank you for coming so late," James began, extending his hand to shake. "I'm told you have a knack for handling difficult cases. I hope you won't mind giving it a try." Ethan, responding to the handshake, only smiled politely. "Of course I will try to help," he said softly. "But let me meet your son first. It usually starts with trust." When they reached the second floor, James knocked softly on the door of Nathan's room. He heard an irritated, "Get off." James tried to add firmness to his voice. "Son, I want you to meet your new teacher. We need to talk." The door creaked open, and Nathan appeared on the doorstep, an ordinary-looking teenager wearing a baseball cap on backwards, a stretched t-shirt and worn jeans. His eyes were throwing lightning bolts. "Another lecturer?" The guy grinned. "Or does he want to play happy family with me?" James wanted to reply sharply, but Ethan put a hand on his shoulder, gesturing for him to be quiet. The teacher looked at Nathan calmly, as if studying his mood. "You can call me Ethan if you want," he said. "Tell me what you like to do in your free time." "I don't like anything," Nathan snorted. "I'm bored with everything at school, and even more so at home." "I understand," Ethan said. "What would you do if no one controlled you now?" Nathan shrugged his shoulders and slammed the door in their faces again. James slammed his fist against the wall in frustration, but Ethan shook his head. "It's too early to jump to conclusions. Let's give him time." Thus began a new chapter in the life of the Lexington family. The owner of the mansion, accustomed to the fact that everything in his life, from transactions on the stock exchange to the improvement of the estate, is decided quickly and clearly, now stood on the threshold of the world of adolescent emotional crises, in which no money does not guarantee obedience and harmony. And only a humble teacher from a poor neighborhood could try to find the key to Nathan's heart. The next night, however, the mansion was filled with screams. James went upstairs and heard Nathan literally bursting with anger and pain, as if dragging all his inner terrors to the light. Ethan, who had been downstairs, ran up the stairs following. What they found made both adults silent. Nathan's room was upside down, and he was crying hysterically, clutching a framed photograph in his hands. At that moment, James remembered his late wife's face and realized that he still didn't know how to talk to his son about what was important. At dawn, Ethan was already in the mansion's library, which he had chosen as his temporary workspace. In his hands was an old book on child psychology, scribbled with notes in the margins. He wanted to formulate some ideas, or at least get in the mood for some difficult conversations before he met with Nathan's parents. Outside the windows, golden light glittered. Every morning, Westchester seemed to be imbued with a spirit of serene wealth. Expensive cars cruising down quiet streets, nannies walking their children on manicured lawns, newspapers laid neatly on the steps of mansions. But inside the Lexington home, there was an unsettling atmosphere. Ethan went into the dining room at lunchtime and saw Ashley, who, on the one hand, was James's secretary and assistant, and on the other hand, was actually the housekeeper. "Good afternoon, Mr. Miller. Would you like some coffee?" Ashley offered with a polite smile. "I guess so, if it's not too much trouble." Ethan nodded. Coffee never hurts. As she turned on the machine, James entered the room. He was wearing a dark suit, his tie slightly loosened, as if he had just returned from an urgent business meeting. In the past, he always came home by 8 o'clock in the evening, tired, but today circumstances forced him to leave his business and be here. "Ethan, can we talk?" he asked, stopping in the doorway. Ethan followed James out into the hallway. He led him into a small meeting room where he usually discussed business matters. But today, James clearly wanted to discuss personal matters. "Ashley told me about yesterday's episode," he began cautiously. Nathan had been hysterical. "Did he talk about his mother again?" Ethan nodded. "Was your wife in the picture?" "Yes, it was a picture of the three of us at Lake Tahoe. My son loved that trip. He tried to tell me he missed her, but I guess he couldn't handle the emotion." James was silent, gritting his teeth. He could see how hard it was for him to talk about his late wife. With her death, he'd lost not only the person he loved, but a part of himself. Maybe the best part. And worst of all, he didn't know how to deal with his son, who obviously still hadn't gotten over the loss. "I realize that money can't solve everything," James said, looking down at his folded hands. "But I need you to help Nathan get his life back on track. He doesn't want to study or talk to me. All he does at school is piss off the teachers. And I can't quit the business, not now." Ethan understood the meaning behind those words. James was the kind of man who was used to a schedule, to success and to results visible at once. But grief is a different thing. It doesn't fit into a schedule, and it isn't solved by deals. Ethan himself, who had experienced the loss of his parents as a child, knew that a child's emotions are like chaos if there is no one to share them with. "I'll be there for you," Ethan answered. "But without your participation, I'm afraid it won't work." James shifted his eyebrows questioningly. "What exactly am I supposed to do? I'm not very good at small talk." Ethan sighed. "Perhaps, for starters, find something that connected him to his mother and would make the memories brighter. Above all, we need to give Nathan back the feeling that his pain isn't devalued." James frowned, remembering. His wife, Hannah Lexington, was a renowned violinist. Her concerts were favored by all of New York's elite. Nathan had accompanied his mother to rehearsals since he was a child. And then illness came quickly and destroyed the family. The child who had been studying music suddenly shut down. "I'm not sure he's ready for music," James said. "It still hurts me myself to hear the sound of the violin." But it might be just what he needs, Ethan said gently. Only if he agrees. The conversation was cut short when Nathan appeared in the doorway. He took a quick glance at Ethan and his father, then turned away. I was told that I have a class today? That's right, Ethan nodded. If you're ready. Okay, Nathan said reluctantly. Just don't make me read the stupid textbooks. I wasn't going to, Ethan grinned. Let's go to the library. There's something there you might like. The boy raised an eyebrow but headed for the library after the teacher. James looked after them hopefully, feeling something change. Maybe this was how it was supposed to be. Ethan's quiet but persistent tactics could get through to Nathan where he, his father, was knocking on closed doors too loudly and rudely. The library was the quietest place in the entire house. Tall shelves of books formed narrow passageways, and the walls were decorated with portraits of not only ancestors, but also famous cultural figures. Hannah Lexington often came here when she was preparing for concerts, looking for inspiration in old sheet music and biographies of great musicians. Ethan motioned for Nathan to sit at the massive oak table in the center. He sat down in the chair opposite, placing a small stack of books in front of him. The covers showed historical novels, fantasy novels, and a biography of a jazz saxophonist. I thought it would be the usual, algebra, grammar, and all that crap, Nathan said with challenge in his voice, looking at the books. There's no arguing that we need to study? Ethan nodded. But first, let's find something that really catches your attention. You can choose any book, read a chapter, and share what you think. Nathan picked up a biography of a jazz saxophonist, flipped through a few pages, and wrinkled his nose. The dude from Harlem? So he was in poverty and then became famous? Is this a lesson on how to rise from the ground up? Not necessarily, but his story is about how music helped him overcome his pain. Maybe it'll be useful to you too. The boy grimaced, but he started reading. At the same time, Ethan took out a shabby diary from his bag, where he wrote down his thoughts about the students. He gave Nathan a few minutes to absorb the text. There was silence in the library, with only the occasional quiet snort from the teenager, who seemed to find some of the points in the book odd or ridiculous. After a while, Nathan pushed the book aside and said, He writes that he hated his life as a child. Hunger, constant fighting. But then his mother gave him an old saxophone, and he felt he could win the battle with his fears through music. Ethan nodded. What do you think of that? Dude just escaped into music so he wouldn't have to deal with his problems. Is that what it's like? Well, sometimes creativity gives you the opportunity to live out grief, anger, frustration. Not to escape, but to express. Nathan bit his lip and thought about it. Ethan noticed that the subject of his mother had touched a nerve. He was probably thinking about Hannah, about how she played the violin. But for now, Ethan didn't want to push, lest he trigger another wave of aggression. Do you want to look at some old sheet music? Ethan suggested cautiously. Why? Nathan was wary. Just to look through them. Maybe you'll find a tune that reminds you of something good. The boy pushed back his chair, exhaled irritably. No, music is what took my mom away from me. She was lost in those endless rehearsals, and then she got sick, and I was alone. I know it's hard, Ethan said, choosing his words. But let me ask you this. When she played, you liked her sound, didn't you? Nathan seemed to freeze for a moment. His gaze flashed back to the same memory that Ethan had talked about with James. How Hannah practiced for long periods of time at home, while his son hid in the corner of the living room, listening to the light, almost magical shimmers of her violin. Yes, I liked it, the boy whispered at last. But now when I hear the violin, I get angry. It's like it took my mom away from me. I understand, Ethan repeated quietly. But it had nothing to do with the music. Disease. Unfortunately, diseases don't choose people by interests, and music is probably the most valuable thing she could have left you. Nathan quickly lowered his eyes, slipped out from behind the desk and said, I need some air. And he left, his sneakers clattering on the hardwood floor. Ethan didn't hold him back, realizing that to understand a teenager, sometimes you have to let him be alone with his thoughts. The boy spent the entire day in his room, almost never coming out for dinner. James wanted to call him downstairs, but Ethan advised him to give his son time. Toward evening, soft sounds like muffled sobs came from Nathan's room, but no one dared to enter, so as not to scare away those emotions. So, step by step, Ethan saw. Behind the outer shell of rudeness and aggression hid a vulnerable, lost child. Saturday morning was cloudy and cool. Heavy clouds hung over the vast lawn, and the first drops of rain reflected in the windows of the Lexington mansion. Ethan sat in the living room, drinking green tea and reviewing the lesson plan he had sketched out for Nathan. To include elements of math, literature, but all of it gradually, interspersed with discussion of interesting topics like music, art, and even simple life stories. James appeared in the living room, wrinkling his shirt collar. "Good morning," he said, smiling languidly. "I'm not used to having weekends at home with nothing to do. Usually I have meetings, negotiations. Now it's like I'm stuck." "Sometimes it's good to be stuck," Ethan replied, sipping his tea. "It reminds us that we can't run forward all the time, ignoring internal problems." They both heard the floorboards creak on the stairs. It meant that Nathan had finally gotten up. He'd spent almost the whole day in his room yesterday, and it wasn't until late at night that Ethan felt the kid come out to quietly grab a sandwich from the refrigerator. Now, judging by his footsteps, he was moving toward the dining room. "I'll try to talk to him," James said and followed his son. In the dining room, Nathan was pouring himself some cereal and milk. When he saw his father, he tensed only slightly, but continued making breakfast. "Good morning, son," James said gently. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," Nathan said briefly. "Listen, I have a suggestion. Why don't we go out together today? To an exhibition or a basketball game?" James asked. "I can get tickets for the New York Knicks if you're interested." Nathan grinned. "Do you seriously think I'm going to be happy to just forget everything and go have fun?" James took a deep breath, trying to contain his irritation. He knew his son wasn't pushing him away on purpose. He just didn't know how to express trust any other way. "Then why don't you suggest how we should spend the day?" James suggested. But Nathan was silent. He sat down at the table and began to eat his cereal, as if to shut himself off from any further conversation. At that moment, Ethan appeared in the doorway. "Hello?" He greeted them both, as if he didn't notice the tension in the air. "Nathan, I wanted to show you an interesting tape. It's about a famous musician who also lost a loved one, but found himself in new compositions. Why don't we listen to it together?" The boy put aside his spoon and looked at his father and teacher with a sidelong glance. His eyes expressed a mixture of distrust and curiosity. "What's so special about it?" he muttered. "There is a tune he dedicated to his mother. They say it helped him through his grief." "All right," Nathan finally said, shrugging his shoulders. "Let's not make any of those Sue comments." Ethan smiled and gestured him into the living room. James was about to leave, but Ethan nodded and invited him too. So all three of them ended up at the speaker system, where Ethan plugged in his phone and turned on the audio. It was a quiet jazz composition in which trumpet and saxophone echoed in an iridescent dialogue. The music was both sad and reassuring. Nathan listened with a frown, but gradually his face changed. When the track ended, Nathan took a deep breath. "Yes, it's not bad," he said softly, "but it doesn't move me as much as my mother's violin. Her music was always special." James pressed his lips together, realizing that this was a painful subject. But he didn't want to stay silent. If he missed these moments, everything would remain under wraps. "The truth is, I can't listen to the violin anymore," James said. "When your mother died, I hid all her records. I thought it would hurt less that way." Nathan looked up at him. "You know it didn't help. The pain didn't go anywhere." In the silence that ensued, Ethan realized that they needed to continue this conversation somehow before they both closed back up. "Maybe it's time to get those tapes out," he suggested quietly. to try to listen to them together and remember what she'd left us. Nathan shrugged grimly. I don't know. I get all tingly inside when I hear her play. But you can play, Ethan reminded him suddenly. I saw a violin case in your room. Do you want us to do nothing without your consent but— No? Nathan answered sharply. I'm not ready yet. He walked out of the living room. James looked after him and cursed quietly. It wasn't working as quickly and easily as he wanted. But Ethan stopped him with a soft look. All this is a difficult path. You can't expect your son to open up in a couple of days. But believe me, he's already started to change. At least he's talking instead of just yelling at us. James ran his hand through his hair, as if to acknowledge that yes, he was making progress. Small steps, if only in small steps. In the evening, when the rain stopped, Ethan offered Nathan a short walk in the park nearby. The boy refused at first, but then, tired of being cooped up, he agreed. They walked along the wet paths. Ethan told him about one of his former schools, where he had to reconcile children from warring neighborhoods. Nathan listened furtively, his hands in the pockets of his sweatshirt. Did any of your students lose their parents too? He asked with sudden interest. Yes, and more than one. There are different situations. The important thing is that the child is not left alone with his pain. Nathan lingered at the bench where 2 pigeons were sitting on the branch above them. The boy looked at them as if he was thinking. Then he asked, How do you know you're not alone? Ethan smiled a little sadly. Sometimes you need to check if there is someone around who is ready to listen and accept you. Maybe it is not even a father or a family member, but a friend, a teacher. And then you realize that you are not alone. Nathan nodded and sighed. I'm afraid of loving music again. What if I forget my mother and move on with my life? Will she stay in the past? Ethan put a hand on his shoulder. Love for music is not a betrayal, but a memory of her. Maybe that way you can feel her close by. The boy frowned and a tear glistened in his eyes, but he quickly turned away and walked further down the path. Ethan realized that phrase had hit him where it hurt, but it also helped him move a little closer to the open wound that needed healing. The deeper the truth, the harder it was to speak it. But in the end, it was the one that would lead them to healing. A few more weeks passed, and there seemed to be a shaky equilibrium in the mansion. Nathan went to the psychologist, where he had been conditionally obliged to go by the principal of the old school, and also studied with Ethan, gradually and reluctantly, but without fierce resistance. He still hadn't touched his violin, which had been left by his mother, but he'd stopped hiding it deep in the closet. James tried to devote more time to his son, even though company business required his presence. He noticed that while Nathan had been swearing and cursing in front of his father, now he kept silent more often, not in protest, but as if listening to himself. One evening when James returned from the office, he heard soft music coming from the living room. He went in and saw Ethan sitting on the couch, humming something almost under his breath. There were sheets of paper with notes on them. Nathan stood next to him, arms crossed over his chest. Are you two writing a song together? James asked in surprise, cautiously moving closer. Minus Mr. Miller has terrible vocal skills, Nathan murmured in a low voice, but without aggression, more like an ironic chuckle. You can sing it yourself, Ethan countered, handing him the sheet. As for the notes, I thought maybe I should try to compose something of my own. You can't avoid music all the time, right? James saw a shadow of doubt slip across Nathan's face, but then he took a deep breath and said in an almost calm tone, All right, we can try. But no drama. When Nathan saw his father enter the room, he was nervous for a second. He was probably afraid of approval or judgment. But James nodded. If you need any help? Well, I don't know how much help I can be, but I'm glad you're doing this. Nathan didn't say anything, but a flicker of timid satisfaction flashed in his gaze. Then he shifted his eyes to Ethan. Well, let's try to play the tune you're talking about. Ethan took out the acoustic guitar he had brought to the mansion earlier to illustrate musical chords. Nathan sat down next to it and took the sketch sheet. The guitar began to play soft chords, and Nathan tried to find a simple but lyrical melody with his voice. His voice was still childish and raspy, but there was a tremor in it, especially when he sang about the light in the window that was so far away. James listened, discreetly wiping moisture from the corners of his eyes. He could see how something had changed in his son in recent weeks. The brashness remained, the teenage prickliness. But there was also something that had almost disappeared since Hannah's death. A spark of creative interest. When the tune ended, silence hung in the room. Ethan patted the strings, muffling their trembling. "That's great," he said softly. "Maybe if you decide to try the violin again, we could do an arrangement?" Nathan looked away, as if he were deciding something important. Finally, he said, "The violin is still lying there." He pointed toward his room. "I haven't opened the case in 6 months." "I know," Ethan nodded, "and I'm not forcing you to do it right now." "But music is not the enemy, Nate." The guy smiled crookedly. "Tomorrow we'll see." The next day, close to noon, as the sunlight flooded the hallway, Ethan was going through the paperwork for the homeschooling program they wanted to set up for Nathan until he returned to regular school. Suddenly, he heard the timid sounds of a violin coming from the second floor. At first, he did not believe his ears, but then they became clearer. He went upstairs and found the door to Nathan's room ajar. The violin sounded tentative. The guy clearly hadn't played in a while. But they were lively, almost reverent notes. Outside the door, he saw Nathan standing with his bow in the air. The violin rested on his shoulder, and his gaze was fixed somewhere in space, as if he saw a memory of his mother. When the melody broke, Ethan knocked softly. "May I?" Nathan nodded silently. He lowered the bow and looked at the teacher, breathing heavily. "Why do I always feel a lump in my throat when I play?" he asked. "Because this music is connected to someone you loved?" Ethan explained softly. "But it will help you to keep it in your heart." Nathan blinked away unsolicited tears and turned away to the window. "I miss my mom. Sometimes I think that if I let myself play, it would hurt me more." "At first, yes," Ethan answered carefully. "But then, that pain can become a reminder of the joy you shared." The boy was silent for a long time, staring out the window. Then he nodded and held the violin close to him, as if hugging him. Ethan touched him on the shoulder, and they remained silent, absorbed in their thoughts. Outside the door was James, who happened to witness this scene, and in his eyes shone something long forgotten. Pride for his son and gratitude to fate that a man like Ethan had come into his life. That night, at dinner, Nathan came to the table. He cautiously approached his father. "Dad, can I play in the living room sometimes? Would you mind?" James's eyes filled with tears. "Of course not. I'd be glad to. I really would." Ethan looked at them both, feeling the tense spring that had kept these two people apart for so long loosen just a little. Another month later, Nathan and Ethan were showing their father a short performance. Nathan timidly played a simple but heartfelt melody on the violin, and Ethan strummed the chords on the guitar. They had composed this composition together, dedicating it to Hannah's memory. A modest rehearsal turned into a major event. Father and son looked at each other without the usual irritation or guilt. At the end of the tune, James stood up and clapped quietly. He wasn't the type to burst into applause, but at that moment there was more in his gaze than words could express. He walked over to his son and held out his hand. "I am proud of you, son." Nathan smiled, and in that smile he was relieved of the cloud that had hung over him for years after his mother's death. Through music, pain, and the help of a teacher he had initially despised for his budget appearance, he had found himself. Ethan, seeing this moment, realized it was for moments like this that he had once decided to become a teacher, despite his modest salary and lack of prestigious credentials. "This is just the beginning," he said out loud, as if to all three of them. "But sometimes the hardest part is taking the first step, and you've already taken it." Outside the window, dusk was falling. The lights of Westchester's houses and expensive stores were on. But inside this mansion, a new, warmer atmosphere was born. It was no longer just a place where father and son lived, but a place where music was played to remind everyone that love and memories stay with us even after a loss. In fact, the Lexington home was once again filled with life. Even though Nathan and his father still had many difficult roads ahead of them, today they were together. And next to them stood Ethan Miller, a teacher who showed that behind the most threatening childish cries and aloofness can be hidden a delicate soul in need of understanding and support.